Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division at the National Library of Medicine. Welcome to all of you this afternoon. This lecture series of the History of Medicine Division promotes awareness and use of NLM and other historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the NLM to recognizing and celebrating diversity. All of our lectures are free and open to the public, and all lectures are also live streamed and archived by NIH Videocasting, a public service made possible through a generous gift to the NLM from the Michael E. DeBakey Medical Foundation. We're certainly grateful to the Michael DeBakey Foundation for this support, which benefits so many who appreciate our lectures and the related programs of the NLM and its History of Medicine Division. Before I introduce our speaker for this afternoon, I'd like to take a moment to let you know about our next History of Medicine lecture. Please join us on Tuesday, March 21st at 2 o'clock Eastern Time in the NLM Lister Hill Auditorium for the inaugural Michael E. DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. Also made possible through the support of the Michael DeBakey Medical Foundation, this program will feature two speakers who will address the legacy of Michael DeBakey as it exists in modern medical practice and in the ongoing public service of the National Library of Medicine. Dr. Shelley McKellar will join us from Canada's Western University, where she is the Jason E. Hanna Chair in the History of Medicine and Associate Professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Surgery. Dr. McKellar will speak on intentional impact, the legacy of Michael E. DeBakey beyond the operating room. Also joining us will be Dr. George P. Noon, Professor of Surgery in the Michael E. DeBakey Department of Surgery at Baylor College of Medicine. Dr. Noon will offer a brief look at Michael E. DeBakey's role in establishing the National Library of Medicine as it is today. So please join us on March 21st, and thank you for joining us today, as it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lauren Miller. Dr. Miller is currently a curatorial assistant at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in the museum's Center for African American Media Arts, where she helps to develop, plan, and mount exhibitions. Dr. Miller earned her doctorate in history from the American University, and she completed her BA at Skidmore as a double major in anthropology and Spanish. Dr. Miller's talk this afternoon will focus on her curation of physician assistants, collaboration and care, one of the latest NLM exhibitions, and a very successful one, I'll add, which helps to mark the 50th anniversary of physician assistants, and which grew from a partnership between the National Library of Medicine and the Physician Assistant Historical Society. In her lecture, Dr. Miller will discuss the process of developing the exhibition as a joint endeavor and the importance of shared authority in creating a successful exhibition. She will explore how the organizational partnership combined resources, knowledge, and archives of both the NLM and the Physician Assistant Historical Society in order to create the strongest exhibition possible, which represented both organizations' needs and their goals. By practicing shared authority, the NLM and the Society combined the history and prominent themes of the profession to produce an engaging exhibit that will appeal to experts and general audiences alike, and perhaps even inspire a new generation of PAs. Dr. Miller, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I just want to thank the National Library of Medicine for having me today. I'm excited to talk to you today about a project that I really enjoyed working on here at the library. So the lecture, as you mentioned, will discuss the collaborative process behind creating the exhibit Physician's Assistants, Collaboration and Care. So developing an exhibit is almost never an individual process. It takes a lot of people doing a lot of different things. And as a curator, I think that one of the most essential things is to be able to listen, compromise, and work well with everyone involved to create the most successful exhibit possible. So I think we were able to do that in this exhibit. And I think it's a great example of how different parties can work together to achieve a mutual goal. So just a little bit about my background and where I came from before doing the exhibit, because I think it's important to recognize that with everyone involved so you can kind of have an idea about where people are coming from. So I worked here at the Library of Medicine for 3 years as a contractor, and I was able to work on a bunch of different shows at the library, which I was very privileged to do. So some of them that I worked on here were pictures of nursing, For All the People and Confronting Violence. They're all great shows. Make sure you see them all. And I helped do a bunch of different things, everything from researching to compiling images and developing lesson plans. So in late 2014, Patricia Toohey, who's the head of the exhibitions program, asked me if I would be interested in curating a joint show on the history of physician's assistants. At the time, I was working toward my PhD, and I finally graduated in August of 2015, so this was all happening while that was going on. I was happy to do the exhibition, and I came with a little bit of curating experience beforehand, so I had worked on shows for the Securities Exchange Historical Society and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. So I think one of the most important things when doing an exhibition is to start by recognizing all the stakeholders who are involved in the project. So in order to do that, you want to make sure that you know what they're expecting from the project and what their goals are, and that's really essential to making any project successful. So in this case, the stakeholders that we were working with were the Physician Assistant History Society, the National Library of Medicine, Design Minds, who was the design team that worked on the show to do the physical design for the banners, and myself, who was the curator. So the group goal, as we defined it when we started the project, was co-developing 6 traveling exhibition panels, which were going to mark the 50th anniversary of the birth of physician's assistants. But within that, each stakeholder came with their own goals and background, which is also important to discuss in order to get a full scope of the project. So the Physician Assistant History Society, they wanted to create this exhibition as a celebration of their profession and its history. They also wanted to highlight their collections because they have quite extensive collections. And they wanted to, so they were founded in May 2002, and their goal is basically to mark the development of the PA profession and illustrate how PAs continue to make a difference in our society. So they had some experience developing exhibitions on their own when they came into the project. They have several exhibitions that they've done online and a couple of physical ones. But they were all done by medical professionals rather than people coming from a history or museum background. So they came with kind of a unique perspective on what exhibits looked like that would be different from someone from another field. So the National Library of Medicine wanted to do a traveling exhibit that appealed to PAs and mass audiences. And that was very important because their exhibits go all over the world as well as all over the country. And you don't really have an idea per se of where they're going to get booked beforehand. So they also, one of their goals is to highlight the collections here at the library. So those were kind of the main things that they were coming in with. Design Minds wanted to create a visually appealing exhibit that could incorporate the feelings that we were trying to project through our exhibit in their design. And as myself coming in, I wanted to do an exhibit that informed a broad group of people why PAs are unique. And I wanted to make sure that it was distinct from other exhibits that the PA History Society had done in its past, because we didn't want to send something that was just a repeat. And I also wanted to do something that would translate well into 6 physical banners that would have to travel all over. So a little bit about museum best practices. So as we discussed, it's important to identify stakeholders and their goals, but you also want to set clear expectations from the beginning about what it's possible to accomplish and what it is not possible to accomplish. So, for example, in this case, it was not going to be possible to include all of the information that the PA Historical Society wanted to include. It's a very limited space with 6 banners. You have to be kind of judicious about what you're saying. You know, there are also limitations such as time frame, budget, and another big thing that we were limited with was objects and images. Since they were traveling banners, we were only going to be able to use images, and those images had to be a high enough resolution that they would work to be blown up on a large banner, and we also had to make sure that we had the rights to them. So one of the other things that we had to do was identify the target audience. I think in this case, the PA Historical Society was a little bit more focused on making an exhibit for PAs to learn about their history, whereas NLM wanted to do something a bit more broad that, you know, any high schooler could come in and look at and understand and appreciate. So coming with a background in public history, I approached the project with my own ideals about what an exhibition should look like and contain. And I think that that's also important to recognize what I came into the project with as a curator, as well as what other people came in with. So one of the most important pieces of curation is shared authority. And this means that ultimately the curator, or me as the curator, is not the ultimate authority or knowledge holder in the project. The curator should moderate the project, and in essence, it should bring everyone's ideas together to make one exhibit. It's also important during that process to make sure that all of the parties involved feel heard and included in the project. I think oftentimes people think that exhibits are just made by picking some images and objects and putting them together and writing about them. But there's actually, for a good, strong exhibit, there's a little bit more involved to it. And I like to think of it as kind of a mixture between a science and an art. So, you know, it's important that it have a main argument, which is supported by evidence, but that evidence also has to be interesting and compelling to look at. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. So in essence, the words and the visuals all need to work together to have a successful exhibit. I kind of see the role of a curator also as a puzzle master who has to fit all of these pieces and elements together to make them work. So one of the key pieces of creating an exhibit, I think, is called the big idea. And the big idea is essentially the main theme of the exhibit. So it should be something relatively simple. I have also worked with academics who are creating exhibits for the first time, and I sometimes like to compare the big idea or creating an exhibit to writing a 5-paragraph essay. So you have your thesis statement, and then you have several themes that support it, and then you have evidence that supports those themes. So really, you need to have a single argument that's going to focus the exhibition and unify all the parts that you're including in it. And what this should do is it should create an exhibition where a visitor leaves and you can ask them, what was the exhibition about? And they will be able to tell you in one sentence. So usually in an exhibition, you have the big idea and then 3 to 5 sub-themes. And the evidence that supports those sub-themes will be things like photographs, objects, etc. So to talk a little bit about the background research for the exhibit, you know, it's important that a curator have a strong knowledge of the topic that they're going to write an exhibit about before they meet with the people who are involved in the exhibit. You know, you have to do secondary source research as well as some primary source research in order to really immerse yourself and start brainstorming about what should the big idea of the exhibit be. It will also give you the skills to successfully talk to people that you're working with, like other stakeholders such as the PA History Society. And this is really important to gaining a client's trust. You know, you have to make sure that you know what you're talking about. So I started performing research on the background of physician assistants, but one of the main problems that I ran into is because it is such a relatively new profession, there is not a lot of historical research written about PAs. So in this case, what I ended up doing was relying more on medical analyses that have been written about PAs, as well as more primary source evidence rather than I would normally rely on. So, you know, the PA Historical Society had an excellent collection, and that was very helpful. They have this text, oh, I have a laser pointer. They have a text called The Physician Assistant and Illustrated History, which actually provides a great overview and background of the profession. But again, it was written by medical professionals, so it's from a different perspective than a historian might take. There have been, the people involved in the History Society are responsible for writing the book and are clearly very interested and supportive of keeping the history of the profession alive. So that was a very helpful resource. They also had a lot of primary sources that were useful, such as photographs from all different periods of time, biographies, oral histories, and original documents from early in the profession. So I used a bunch of those as well for research. The History of Medicine division had a really great collection of pictures of early physician's assistants, and you can see this is an example of one of them right here. That's a doctor and a PA at GW in the 1970s, so right after the profession started. They also had secondary sources and medical sources that were helpful for the background research on the project. And there's a collection of documents from the American Academy of Physician Assistants here, which I looked at, and those were very helpful as well, just to get an idea of some of the original background documents. And then finally, since it was such a unique project with not as much historical research, I also relied a lot on professional publications and newspapers. So the PA Professional was a good resource that had a lot of different types of articles highlighting what was going on in the field today. They also had a lot of great images that we ended up using in the exhibit. So as I went on and started developing an initial script, several themes started to emerge to me. And as a layperson, or as someone who started out as a layperson in the subject, I tried to choose themes that I thought were interesting to myself and might also translate to a broader audience. So those themes were the changes in American society, culture, and healthcare that led to a need for PAs, the profession based on aiding underserved people and populations, its flexibility and adaptation, and how it has continued to expand and grow over the past 50 years. So we presented these ideas to the PA History Society, and they liked them. Began to develop a script with kind of a brief outline that would incorporate all of these themes. But at this point, it was still kind of confined by a time frame. So instead of working thematically, we were doing the exhibit based on decades, which ended up not really working. As the script started to develop, we kind of realized that it would be very difficult to squeeze 50 years of history into 4 panels, essentially, 5 panels, because we had one introductory panel. So basically, the initial big idea that I had come up with was the PA is a uniquely American profession based on adaptation and flexibility. PAs developed as a reaction to the changing social, cultural, and healthcare landscapes of the 20th century American post-war world and continue to adapt today, even enjoying international growth. Now, based on what I just said, this is way too big. This is just not going to work. There's no way you can talk about all of this in 6 panels. And this is kind of also an example of the initial layout that we had planned for the exhibit. And you can see here that we had, 75 words for main text and then 50 words for subtext. And based on looking at the panels now, there was just no way all of that text was going to work on one panel. So basically, we realized this wasn't working. It was too much information. Kind of had to revisit what the plan was. And we also ended up having some problems with visuals. So the library and I really wanted to make a concerted effort to have a show that was visually compelling and was not just made up of people's headshots talking about the best of in the fields. So we wanted to make sure that all of the passion and themes that we were talking about in the exhibit actually showed through in the images. And it was also important to show photographs that had PAs and patients on equal footing. So we didn't want to show PAs in a position of power over patients because it is a collaborative effort and PAs collaborate with their patients. So we began tweaking the script and we got some feedback from the PA History Society, and we started doing some changes in themes, images, and wording. And this is kind of when the idea of collaboration really came into effect. So, as we discussed before, every stakeholder comes in with their own ideas and expectations about the project. And the PA History Society, it was a little difficult because we initially started with over 5 people on the board who were all working on the project with the library at the same time. And logistically, that was just difficult. It was hard to schedule times for calls. It was hard to have so many people who all wanted to contribute so actively and have a productive phone call at the same time. And also people had different opinions and perspectives about what they thought the show should be. So I think eventually everyone realized that it would be easier if we had a fewer number of people. So we narrowed it down to 2 people from the PA History Society who worked with me and the National Library of Medicine. And then those people would be the kind of day-to-day working on the script, and they would lead the big decisions up to the board. And so the board would still look at them, but not everyone would be involved in the nuts and bolts. And I think initially the History Society had more of an idea that they wanted the exhibit to be similar to their published book, which was an illustrated history of the profession, and they have a similar timeline online. And those are great resources, but it just wasn't going to translate very well into a 6-panel exhibit. So basically, during the meetings, I found that my job ended up being listening to the feedback from the PA History Society and trying to see how I could translate their ideas and still incorporate what they wanted, but turn it into a product that was going to work for this particular situation. So we ended up having some compromises, obviously, and you do in every project. And a couple of them that I'll share with you today, I think, are good examples of how we were able to work through issues. So the PA History Society wanted to use very specific professional language that a layperson might not understand. And so what we ended up doing was going through the script and with them on the phone, and they would put in the language they wanted to use. And if we thought it would work, I would say, that's great. Or I would say, well, I don't really quite understand what this means, and I've worked on this project, so maybe we need to rethink the word that we're going to use. Or, I would have a word that would be more general, and they would say, no, it's really important to say this specific term. So I think that we were able to find a good compromise by speaking with each other and really going through the script on that minute level. They also wanted to show particular people who are important to the profession and kind of highlight these personalities, which I wasn't opposed to, but the problem that we ran into was that many of the images that they had, as I mentioned earlier, just weren't very compelling for an exhibit. So for example, this is one of the well-known PAs. Her name is Joyce Nichols. She's kind of a pioneer in the profession. And this was originally similar, well, this or another headshot were the two images that we had to work with. And so once I and the library went back to them and said, listen, we really want to show the dynamism that exists in the profession through the images, they understood what we were saying. And they really went to great lengths to go and find other images that would be appropriate and useful for the exhibit. So we ended up using this image, which I think is a much better example of a PA at work with the community and doing something important. And finally, one of the major kind of compromises that we came up with was after we had developed the final outline of the script, they came back and read it and said, listen, we really think it's important to have one panel that specializes on, or that focuses on specialization of PAs and the different types of jobs they're doing in different fields of medicine. So at that point, I was able to rearrange one of the panels to change it to focus more on collaboration within specific fields of medicine and incorporate the ideas that I had on that panel originally into another panel. And then, importantly, we also worked as a group with design minds to really try and convey to them what we wanted the exhibit to look like. So, I've talked a little bit about the idea of motion and activity, how we wanted to incorporate that in the exhibit. And this logo that Design Minds developed is a good example. So they initially had the stethoscope, and we said, we want to kind of bring that to life a little bit. So then they were able to add the lines on the side to it, which gives it a bit more motion and I think kind of enhances the logo for the exhibit. Okay, so finally, this is the final product. I think that it came out really well, and as you can see, we were able to narrow it down to one main idea, which was PAs collaborate with other medical professionals, patients, and diverse communities to provide all patients with the best care possible. So giving a little introduction to what PAs are for the layperson who might not know. And then the main idea is collaboration is the foundation of their profession. So as you can see, we developed 5 panels that relate to different themes in collaboration. The first one is called Part of a Team, and that talks about how PAs collaborate with other medical professionals to work as a team. The second one is Diversity Makes a Difference, and that panel discusses how PAs collaborate with each other, PAs who come from different ethnic, cultural, racial backgrounds, and how they help different groups of people as well. Then collaboration with new partners is the panel that I mentioned, where we talked about how PAs have developed specialties by reaching out and working with different areas of medicine. So they've kind of expanded the profession in that way. And then respond to community needs, discusses how PAs work with patients to meet their other basic needs besides just medical needs by providing food, shelter, and emotional support. So they're collaborating with their patients in a sense. And then finally, Care Around the World shows how PAs have worked as part of a team and kind of promoted diversity around the world and opened up new programs. Even though PA is an American profession originally, they've opened up new programs and really worked with other communities around the world to spread the profession and help people. So that's the exhibit. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. So you would use both in an exhibit, but generally, to get a sense of what you're going to write about, you would read secondary sources first, just to get a sense of what people have said about it. Well, this is coming from a historical perspective, so get a sense of how historians have talked about it in the past. You know, are there any debates going on in the field about the topic? And once you have kind of a larger sense of that, then you would look into primary sources and, you know, work with whatever organization you're working with to see what they have for primary sources or what they're interested in getting. Yes? You know, I think that everyone was really quite happy with the show all around. I think even though it might not have been what the History Society said they wanted in the beginning, I think it's what they envisioned. So, you know, as I kind of mentioned, I think it's important to be able to listen to what people are saying, but really hear and suss out what they're trying to say. So I think overall, everyone who was involved is very proud of the exhibit and happy. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes. So, you know, I really wanted to make sure that we showed in the exhibit that, well, I should explain first that PAs initially began as mostly white men who were veterans. And so that was kind of the path the profession was on for a couple of years. And then since that point, it's broadened out a lot. And they've really made active efforts to recruit all different types of people around the world. So I really wanted to make sure that we highlighted that visually to show that PAs are not just white men, they're people of every different race, gender, color. And so, you know, I think it was important for me to show the wide diversity, which also ended up bringing a lot of color and life to the exhibit that might not have been if we had tried to stick with more historical photos like you have here and here. They tend to be in black and white, and they're not as necessarily interesting to look at. So I also wanted to show that people who are treated by PAs are a really wide variety of people as well. So that was very important to show anyone can be treated by a PA. And it's not just what the profession originally meant or intended, which was kind of helping underserved communities. Did you have a question in the back? That's a really good question. I think, I don't know about new voices per se in terms of particular people. The PA Society has a really rich biography section, and so that was very helpful to me in terms of picking out different people who I thought had interesting paths. But I do think that it has helped point out maybe new themes of physician's assistants that people had not thought about before. You know, I don't know that the idea of collaboration has been explained in such a wide array of ways. So I think also highlighting diversity is something that's added a bit by the exhibit. But yeah, that's a very good question. Oh, thank you. Design Minds. They did an excellent job. They really do a great job. And actually, one of my favorite things that we did here to show kind of diversity in different ways was, if you'll notice these little dots, those all represent each place on the map globally where each story on the banner takes place. So you can kind of see the wide array. On the main one here, we have all the different stories all over the world. So it really is quite a diverse profession. Yes?
Speaking of these stories, you talked about the variety of places the photos came from. What are the challenges around
Those are big challenges. Yeah, so, with any photo, you need to do your due diligence and make sure that you have permission to reprint it. And that can be very challenging. With some of the photos, we found them in a really wide variety of places, like the ones that came from professional magazines or organizations were a little bit easier to track down because we at least know who the people were. Trying to think if there were any that were particularly difficult. Sometimes it just requires a little bit of digging, like, you know the person's name, but maybe you can't find them or contact them, or you don't know who took the picture. So it can be challenging, but, we had a really great team of people who helped do all of the permissions and track these people down. So that made it a lot easier. But yeah, that's definitely an essential part of printing any exhibit. You want to make sure that you have everyone's permission to use their images. And actually,
what's the range of reactions you get from people?
you get a wide range. Sometimes if it's a professional photographer, sometimes people want money to use images. Sometimes people are very excited, like there's I think it's one of the images that we have on the online exhibit, which is a bit more expanded. But we got it from one PA who has done a lot of work trying to build the profession overseas. And she was so excited that she just kept sending us more and more photos. And it was great. They were amazing photos. But at some point, we had to say, OK, we've done the exhibit. We can't take any more from you. But yeah, people are sometimes very excited about it. And some of the images also came from the military, which was a great source because those are in the public domain, so you can use them freely. But yeah, this woman, Winnie, we had to contact her personally, and she actually sent us that photo because we were looking for a photo of her in particular. We couldn't really find one that we liked, and so she sent us that one, which I think is, ended up being one of the full banner photos, so it was a great addition. Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I just wanted to add to that is that the green light shows on. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to add that sometimes complicates it with these types of images is because there are so many people in them, and also if there are children in them, that's a different thing. So in this kind of situation, you have teachers, you have PAs, you have patients, so you have to expand it. I know that there's one particular image in here where we cropped it in a certain way because there was a child in it, and it was, but it depends on what the original use was of the image, whether they themselves got permission from the people. So this was a little bit more complicated in that there's a lot of people, and it has to do with medical types of things.
Yes, Jill was one of the experts, if you couldn't tell, who helped us with the permissions. And Nicole, they did an awesome job. So it definitely makes it much easier if you have people who know what they're doing in terms of permissions, who can help you out. Yes?
Yeah, can you tell me what the factors were that attracted military veterans to the profession of physician assistant? Were they disabled veterans? Or?
No. So you can read a blog about this online if you'd like. But basically, after the Vietnam War, there had been some changes in insurance and how the medical system was kind of happening, and more people were going to hospitals rather than private physicians. And there kind of developed this gap where there weren't enough physicians to take care of the general public. And these military veterans were coming back from Vietnam, and they didn't have jobs, and they had all been in the medical corps. So they had some experience, background experience in treating people on the field, and they had the experience but not necessarily the education. So these programs were designed to kind of fill that gap by giving them a shortened education, less than a doctor, but enough so that they could practice under a physician at first, and kind of fill in that gap and help physicians move more quickly through patients. And then eventually it evolved to PAs taking over for physicians in some extent, some circumstances.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Dr. Miller, may I ask you a question? Tell us a little bit about how, what you learned through this experience, how you brought that into your current position at the Smithsonian. Tell us a little bit more about your work currently and lessons you learned, ideas that came to you, and how you've kind of carried those lessons on in your career at the Smithsonian.
Sure. You know, I think doing this project was probably really helped me get my position at the Smithsonian. Saying that you've been able to curate a show on your own, you know, and that you have the skills to help research rights for images, developing an exhibit script and themes. Those are all very helpful skills to kind of have that you don't necessarily get the opportunity to acquire all the time. And I think one of the main lessons that I really took away is the idea of collaboration, and that you need to, you know, there might be moments that are frustrating when you're working on a project with so many different entities and people with different needs, but I think that if you can really try and treat people with respect and come to some kind of compromise, that's a very, very useful skill to have. And so, you know, being diplomatic yet firm about things is very important. And I think, you know, at the Smithsonian, you work with so many different people and the projects are so large. So there's 10 times more moving parts than were involved in this project. But, you know, I think having those skills has really helped me learn how to move projects forward smoothly in a way that's important when you work with that many different people.
Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Miller? If not, on behalf of the National Library of Medicine, Dr. Miller, thank you very much and for your service in this great capacity, great exhibition. Thank you for your talk
Thank
today.
you all for coming.